She was 25 years old and left with nothing. After her father's death, the Town Council of Redemption, Wyoming, seized their small cabin on the basis of a disputed debt, a 30-year-old claim as thin as frost. She was given 3 days to vacate. With no family, no money beyond a few dollars scraped from a jar, and no plan, she was left with only a small trunk of her father's tools and the clothes on her back. She did not plead or weep. She simply packed what she could carry and walked away from the only home she had ever known. But before she left, her father's last words echoed in her mind, pointing her toward a derelict assay office on the forgotten edge of town. What nobody in Redemption knew, what had been buried for a generation, was that a secret hidden beneath its crumbling hearthstone held the power to unravel the town's very foundation and change Martha Mercer's life forever. Settle in and get comfortable, for this is a story about how truth, once buried, will always find its way to the light. We love hearing where our stories are heard, so please let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. The path that led Martha to that cold morning of dispossession began long before her birth, rooted in the quiet character of her father, Elias Mercer. Elias was a carpenter, a man who spoke more fluently with a saw and a block plane than he ever did with words. He had come to the Wyoming Territory in the late 1850s, not for gold or land, but for the quiet anonymity of the mountains. He was a widower, his wife having been taken by a fever back east when Martha was just an infant, and he raised his daughter alone with a steady, undemanding tenderness. Their life was contained within the small, 2-room cabin he had built with his own hands at the far end of the valley, just beyond the official town plat. It was a place of simple, profound sufficiency. The walls were stout, the roof was sound, and the scent of pine shavings and wood smoke was the constant perfume of Martha's childhood. Elias taught her everything he knew. He did not distinguish between a son's work and a daughter's. Before she was 10, she could identify the grain of oak versus ash, and she knew the precise, patient rhythm of a crosscut saw. By 15, she could frame a wall, square and true, and her hand was as steady as his on the grip of a drill. Her most prized possession, the object that connected her to him more than any other, was his framing hammer. It was a beautiful tool, perfectly balanced, its octagonal head worn smooth and slightly rounded at the edges from a lifetime of striking nails. The hickory handle, darkened to a rich mahogany from the oil of his hand, was shaped to his grip, a perfect extension of his will. He had taught her how to hold it, not to choke up on the neck, but to hold it at the end of the handle for maximum leverage and force. "Let the tool do the work, Martha," he would say, his voice a low rumble. "Don't fight it. Just guide it." It was a lesson she applied to more than just carpentry. He also taught her to read, not just from the Bible or the almanac, but from the town ledgers he was occasionally hired to help audit. He had a fine, clear hand and an uncommon head for figures. He taught her to see the stories hidden in the columns of numbers, to notice the small inconsistencies and the debts that were carried too long or forgiven too quickly. It was this skill that had first brought the old debt against their own property to his attention. A phantom entry from 1850, the year the town was founded, a supposed lien for survey fees that no one had ever tried to collect. He had called it a clerical error, a ghost on the page, and had thought little more of it. To him, the cabin and the land it stood on were his by the right of his own labor, a truth more solid than any line of ink in a dusty book. This quiet confidence, this belief in the tangible world over the administrative one, was the greatest and most perilous inheritance he left her. The end came not with a shout, but with a quiet knock on the door. It was 3 days after they had buried Elias in the small cemetery overlooking the valley. Martha was standing at the dry sink, washing her father's last teacup, when she saw the 3 men from the town council walking up the path. Judge Hemlock was in the lead, a man whose posture was as rigid and unyielding as the starched collar at his throat. He was flanked by Mr. Gable, the owner of the mercantile, a man whose gaze seemed perpetually fixed on his own shoes, and a younger man named Finch, who served as the council's clerk. Martha dried her hands on her apron and met them on the porch. She did not invite them in. Judge Hemlock did not waste time with condolences. He produced a single folded paper from his coat pocket. "Miss Mercer," he began, his voice flat and administrative, "the council has met regarding the outstanding lien on this property. The debt, with 30 years of interest, has been called due." He unfolded the paper. It was an eviction notice. The original $50 survey fee had, with accumulated charges and penalties, become an impossible sum of nearly $500. Martha stared at the paper, her face calm, though a cold dread was spreading through her chest. She knew the history of the claim. Her father had explained it to her years ago, a baseless charge, likely a mistake, that he had refused to acknowledge. "My father disputed this," she said, her voice even. "He said the claim had no merit." Judge Hemlock gave a slight, dismissive shrug. Elias Mercer was given ample opportunity to settle the matter. He chose not to. "The council's decision is final. The property reverts to the town's ownership in lieu of payment." Mr. Gable cleared his throat, his eyes still on the porch boards. "We're sorry for your loss, Martha, truly, but the law is the law." The hypocrisy of his words was a physical thing, thick and suffocating in the cold morning air. Martha looked from his downturned face to Hemlock's impassive one. She saw no room for appeal, no flicker of mercy. They had waited until her father was gone, until she was alone and vulnerable, to make their move. There was a cruelty in the timing that went beyond mere bureaucracy. She did not argue. She did not beg. To do so would have been to grant them a power over her that she refused to yield. It would have dishonored the quiet dignity her father had lived by. She simply folded the paper and held it in her hand. "I understand," she said. The men seemed almost disappointed by her lack of protest. They had come prepared for tears or hysterics, and her composure left them with nothing to do. After a moment of awkward silence, they turned and walked away. Martha stood on the porch, the paper growing damp in her palm, and watched them go. Then she went back inside and began to pack. The process was a quiet torment. Every object was a memory. Her mother's quilt from the bed, her father's worn leather-bound copy of Shakespeare. She carefully wrapped each of his tools in oilcloth, the saws, the planes, the chisels, the brace and bits, and placed them in the bottom of a large pine trunk he had built for her. Finally, she took the hammer from its loop on his tool belt, which still hung from a peg by the door. She held its familiar weight in her hand, the smooth, dark hickory a comfort against her skin. She placed it on top of the other tools, closed the lid, and slid the bolt home. She had 2 days left. The journey was not long in miles, but it was a crossing from one life into an abyss. On the third morning, Martha dragged the heavy pine trunk off the porch of the cabin and closed the door behind her for the last time. She did not lock it. It was no longer hers to lock. She did not look back. With the trunk's rope handle cutting into her shoulder, she began to walk, not toward the center of town where pitying or scornful eyes would follow her, but away from it, toward the steep, scrub-choked rise at the north end of the valley. Her destination was a place she had only heard about in her father's stories, the old Polaris assay office, a relic from the town's earliest mining boom. It sat on a small, worthless parcel of land that had been part of an old claim her father had once bought for a pittance, a claim the town council had either forgotten or deemed too insignificant to seize. In his final weeks, as his strength failed, Elias had spoken of it. "If the worst happens," he had rasped, his voice thin as paper, "go to the Polaris office. The claim is still in my name. It's not much, but it's something. Check the floor beneath the hearth." At the time, she had dismissed it as the wandering talk of a dying man. Now it was her only hope. The path was barely visible, a faint track overgrown with sagebrush and littered with loose scree. The climb was steep, and the weight of the trunk was a constant, brutal anchor. The sun beat down, and the dry Wyoming wind whipped dust into her eyes and scoured her face. With every step, the town of Redemption fell away below her, the grid of its streets looking small and orderly from a distance, belying the quiet corruption at its heart. She could see the steeple of the church, the broad roof of Gable's Mercantile, and the neat fenced yard of Judge Hemlock's house. From up here, she could also see her own cabin, looking like a child's toy, a place where her life had been lived and then erased. A wave of grief, sharp and sudden, threatened to overwhelm her, but she pushed it down. Grief was a luxury she could not afford. Survival was the only work that mattered now. She adjusted the rope on her shoulder and kept climbing, her focus narrowing to the next step, and the next. The air grew thinner, cooler, scented with pine and the clean, mineral smell of rock. After nearly an hour of grueling ascent, she saw it. The Polaris Assay Office was little more than a ruin. It was a small, single-room structure of rough-hewn logs, tucked into a shallow cut in the mountainside. The roof sagged dangerously in the middle, half its shingles gone, and the single window was a gaping hole of broken glass. The door hung from one leather hinge. It was a place of profound and absolute neglect, a testament to failed hopes. Anyone else would have seen it as uninhabitable, a shelter for pack rats and nothing more. But Martha Mercer, daughter of Elias Mercer, saw something else. She saw solid log walls that were mostly true. She saw a foundation of native stone that had not shifted. She saw a structure, broken but not defeated. She saw work to be done. Dropping the trunk with a gasp of relief, she walked slowly toward the derelict building. It was the first piece of property that was truly, if tenuously, hers. It was a ruin, but it was a beginning. Martha pushed open the groaning door and stepped inside. A thick blanket of dust coated every surface, stirred into dancing motes by the light pouring through the broken window and the gaps in the roof. The air was heavy with the smell of decay, of damp earth and the dry, papery nests of long-gone rodents. In the center of the room stood a heavy oak table, its surface warped and split. Against the far wall was a stone hearth and a rusted pot-bellied stove, its pipe disconnected and lying on the floor like a broken limb. A crude cot, its canvas rotted away to strings, was shoved into one corner. It was a desolate scene, a portrait of abandonment. For a long moment, she simply stood in the doorway, the sheer scale of the task ahead threatening to crush her resolve. The cold from the dirt floor seeped through the thin soles of her boots. Night would come soon, and with it, the deep, penetrating cold of the high country. She had no food, no water, and only the clothes she wore and the contents of her trunk. The impulse to sit down and weep was a physical force, a pressure behind her eyes. But then she thought of her father. She thought of his hands, calloused and capable, and his quiet mantra, just guide it. Despair was a fight, and she had been taught not to fight the tool. She had been taught to work. She took a deep breath, the dusty air catching in her throat, and set her shoulders. First, shelter. She dragged the heavy trunk inside and unbolted the lid. The familiar sight of her father's tools was a comfort, a tangible link to a world of competence and order. She selected a small handsaw and a handful of nails. Outside, she found a pile of discarded lumber from a collapsed sluice box, weathered but still sound. She measured and cut boards to cover the gaping window, prying the broken shards of glass from the frame with the claw of her hammer. The rhythmic rasp of the saw and the percussive report of the hammer were familiar, reassuring sounds in the oppressive silence. It was not a pretty repair, but it was solid. It would keep the worst of the wind out. Next, the stove. The pipe was rusted through in several places, but she managed to piece together a functional length of it. Using strips of tin she cut from an old coffee can found in a corner. She wedged it through the rusted thimble in the roof, securing it with wire. She swept the hearth clear of debris, and using her flint and steel, managed to coax a tiny, struggling flame from a handful of dry grass and twigs she gathered from outside. Slowly, she fed it larger pieces of wood until a steady, welcome warmth began to push back the chill. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. As darkness fell, she sat on her trunk before the glowing stove, the firelight casting flickering shadows on the log walls. She was exhausted, her muscles aching from the climb and the work. She was alone in a ruined cabin, a pariah from the town she had called home. But she was warm. She was sheltered. By her own hand, she had imposed a small circle of order onto the chaos. It was not a home yet, not by a long measure. But in that moment, sitting in the dark with the smell of wood smoke filling the small space, Martha Mercer was not acquiring a property. She was claiming herself. After a few days of securing her shelter, making the small room weathertight and habitable, Martha's thoughts turned to her father's final, cryptic instruction. Check the floor beneath the hearth. The hearth was made of 3 large, flat slabs of granite, likely dragged from the nearby creek bed, set into the dirt floor and sealed with a mortar of mud and lime that had hardened to the consistency of rock. It looked immovable, a solid anchor for the heavy stove that now sat upon it. She was tired, and the work of fetching water from a spring she'd found a quarter-mile down the slope and foraging for wood took up most of her daylight hours. It would be easy to dismiss his words as delirium, to focus only on the immediate needs of survival. But she knew her father. He was not a man for fanciful notions. If he had said it, there was a reason. She took her hammer and a cold chisel from the trunk. Kneeling on the cold floor, she began to chip away at the mortar in the seam between 2 of the stones. It was slow, arduous work. The mortar was old and dense, and each swing of the hammer sent a jarring shock up her arm. Flakes of dried mud and stone peppered her face. For hours she worked, her world reduced to the small expanding gap in front of her, the sharp ring of steel on stone, the only sound besides her own ragged breathing. Finally, she had cleared a deep enough groove along all 4 sides of the center stone. She wedged the end of a long iron pry bar, another treasure from the trunk, into the gap. She put all her weight on it, her muscles straining. The stone groaned, shifted, but did not lift. She repositioned the bar, finding a better purchase, and tried again. This time, with a grating screech of rock on rock, the heavy slab tilted upwards. A puff of stale, subterranean air escaped from the darkness beneath. Her heart pounded in her chest. She worked her fingers under the edge of the stone, and with a final desperate heave, flipped it over. Beneath it was a rectangular cavity, about 2 feet long and a foot wide, neatly dug into the compacted earth. And nestled inside, resting on a bed of dry sand, was a rusted iron strongbox. It was not large, but it was heavy, bound with 2 thick bands of iron and fastened with a formidable, corroded lock. A thick layer of rust and dirt caked its surface, but it was intact. She reached down and wrapped her hands around it. The metal was cold, ancient. She lifted it out. It was heavier than she expected, a solid, dense weight that spoke of something more than empty space. She sat back on her heels, her hands resting on the cold iron, and stared at it. 100 questions flooded her mind. What was inside? Why had her father known about it? Was this his secret, or someone else's? The lock was a solid mass of rust. There was no key, and even if there were, it would be useless. She knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that she could not open it alone. And she knew there was only one person in Redemption with the skill and the strength to break it open. Caleb Kane, the town's blacksmith, a man as quiet and guarded as her own father had been. A man who, she had heard whispered, had once been a deputy, but had turned in his badge for reasons no one ever spoke of aloud. The next morning, Martha wrapped the heavy strongbox in a burlap sack and carried it down the mountain. The journey was easier this time, downhill, but the weight of the box was awkward and punishing. As she entered the town's main street, she felt the stares of the few people who were out. They saw the dispossessed Mercer girl, returning like a ghost. She ignored them, her gaze fixed on the dark, open doors of the smithy at the far end of town, from which the rhythmic clang of a hammer on an anvil rang out. She found Caleb Kane bent over his forge, his face illuminated by the orange glow of the coals. He was a man in his early 30s, broad-shouldered and lean, his powerful arms slick with sweat. He looked up as her shadow fell across the threshold, his hammer falling silent. His eyes, a startlingly clear blue in his soot-smudged face, were wary. "Miss Mercer," he said, his voice a low baritone. He did not ask what had become of her. He did not offer sympathy. He simply waited. "Mr. Kane," she replied, her own voice steady. "I need your help." She placed the sack on the packed earth floor and unwrapped the strongbox. Caleb stared at it, his expression unreadable. He walked over and crouched down, running a hand over the rusted surface. He tapped the lock with a knuckle. "That's old," he said. "Where did you find it?" "Hidden in the old Polaris office." A flicker of something, interest perhaps, or recognition, crossed his face. "I need it opened," she said. "I'll pay you for your time." He stood up, wiping his hands on a leather apron. He looked from the box to her face, his gaze searching. Caleb Kane had been a deputy long enough to learn that trouble often came in quiet packages. He had left that life behind after a dispute with Judge Hemlock over a questionable arrest, choosing the solitary honesty of the forge over the compromised justice of the council. "This could be trouble," he said, not as a warning, but as a statement of fact. "The trouble is already here," Martha answered. Her quiet certainty seemed to decide it for him. "All right," he said with a nod. "Let's see what's inside." He took the box to his anvil. It was too risky to simply smash the lock, the contents could be damaged. Instead, he worked with a patient, surgical precision. He used a small, sharp chisel and a light hammer, tapping at the rusted hinge pins. After an hour of careful work, the pins gave way. He set down his tools and pried the heavy lid open. Inside, nestled on a bed of what looked like dried wool, were three objects. The first was a stack of banknotes, wrapped in oilcloth. They were old, issued by a Denver bank in the 1850s, but the paper was still crisp. The second was a small, tarnished silver locket on a delicate chain. And the third was a letter, a single sheet of paper, folded and sealed with wax. Martha reached in with a trembling hand and picked up the letter. The wax seal crumbled at her touch. She unfolded the paper. The handwriting was neat, precise. She began to read aloud, her voice filling the quiet space of the smithy. "To whoever finds this, my name is Silas Kane. If you are reading this, I am likely dead. It is October of 1850. 30 years ago. 30 years, I was a fool. I rode with a gang, and we took a stagecoach carrying the payroll for the Union Pacific Survey. A fortune. My partners were men I trusted. After the robbery, they turned on me. They shot me and left me for dead, but I survived long enough to hide my share here, in this office where I once worked as an assayer. They took the rest and used it to build themselves a town. They called it redemption. They became its founding fathers, its righteous judges and its wealthy merchants. The man who shot me was named Alistair Hemlock. His partners were Josiah Gable and Thomas Finch. They pinned the crime on a local prospector, a good man who was hanged for a crime he did not commit. This money is all I have left of a life I threw away. The locket belongs to a woman I will never see again. Use the money. Do with it what you will. But know the truth. The pillars of redemption are built on stolen gold and a dead man's blood." Martha's voice faltered at the end. She looked up at Caleb. He was staring at the letter, his face pale beneath the soot. Hemlock, Gable, Finch, the fathers of the town's current leaders. The names from the eviction notice. The ghost on the page of her father's ledger was not a clerical error. It was the beginning of a 30-year-old lie. "My father," she whispered. "They took our home because they were afraid of what he might find. Caleb looked from the letter to the banknotes to Martha's face. The wariness in his eyes was replaced by a slow burning anger. "We need proof," he said, his voice low and tight. "More than just this. We need to connect the dots." That night, while Martha used 2 of the old banknotes to buy lumber, nails, and a pane of glass from a stunned and suddenly deferential Mr. Gable, Caleb Kane lit a lantern in the town clerk's office, a key he had never returned letting him in. He began to search the oldest ledgers, looking for a name, Silas Kane. And as Martha began the true rebuilding of her home, Caleb began the careful dismantling of a town's history. The assay office began to transform under Martha's hands. The work was a balm, a physical manifestation of her will against the forces that had tried to erase her. With the money from the strongbox, she was no longer limited to salvage and scraps. She bought milled lumber from the new sawmill upriver, and, using her father's planes, smoothed each board until it was silken to the touch. She built a proper floor, laying the planks tight and true over the cold dirt, the scent of fresh-cut pine filling the small cabin. She rechinked the log walls with a mixture of clay from the creek bed and dried grasses, pressing it into the gaps with a small trowel until the room was sealed against the wind. The window, once a gaping hole, now held a single, clear pane of glass that looked out over the valley, a view she had earned. Each swing of the hammer was a declaration. Each saw cut was an act of creation. She was not just repairing a building, she was constructing a future. While she worked, Caleb pursued the ghost of Silas Kane through the town's paper history. In a dusty property ledger from 1850, he found it. A land transfer, the original deed for the land on which Judge Hemlock's house now stood, sold for a nominal fee from Alistair Hemlock to the town council he himself chaired. The date of the sale was 1 week after the stagecoach robbery. In the cemetery records, he found the grave of the hanged prospector, a man named Isaac Bell, buried in an unmarked plot in the potter's field. And in the archives of the old territorial newspaper, he found a brief article about the robbery, mentioning that the stolen payroll consisted of new banknotes from the First Bank of Denver, with a list of their serial numbers. The community, which had first cast Martha out, began to shift around her, not in a single wave, but one person at a time. The change started with small, quiet gestures. Elspeth, an elderly widow whose husband had lost his farm in a legal dispute with Judge Hemlock's father years ago, appeared at Martha's door one evening. She carried a heavy, patchwork quilt. "A house needs warmth," she said, her voice raspy with age, and refused to stay for thanks. Mr. Gable, the merchant, whose father had been named in Silas's letter, seemed haunted. When Martha came to buy flour and coffee, he would not meet her eye, but he gave her a generous measure and added a small sack of sugar at no charge. He was a man trapped between his inheritance and his conscience. Caleb became a steady presence. He would come up the path in the evenings, after the forge had cooled, sometimes with a piece of news from his research, sometimes just to share a cup of coffee and sit in the quiet warmth of her cabin. He repaired the broken iron latch on her door, his work strong and elegant. He never spoke of the future or of feelings, but his presence was a constant, unspoken reassurance. She was no longer alone. The final piece fell into place with the arrival of Judge Morrison, a traveling territorial judge, a man whose authority superseded the local council. Caleb, hearing of his impending visit, had sent a letter ahead. Judge Morrison, a stern, sober man with a reputation for integrity, agreed to meet them not in the town hall, but in Martha's newly finished cabin. On a cold November afternoon, Martha and Caleb laid out their evidence on the smooth oak table she had built: Silas Kane's letter, the old banknotes, and Caleb's meticulous research from the town records. Judge Morrison examined each piece in silence. He held one of the banknotes up to the light, comparing its serial number to the list from the old newspaper article Caleb had found. He read the letter from Silas Kane twice. Finally, he looked up, his gaze resting on Martha. This town was built on a crime, he said, his voice heavy. And it seems the sons have been protecting the sins of the fathers. The next day, Judge Hemlock was removed from his position, his authority stripped by the territorial court. The fabricated debt against Elias Mercer's name was officially expunged, and the deed to her family cabin was returned to Martha. She held the paper in her hand, the proof of her vindication. But when she looked from the deed to the small, solid cabin she had rebuilt with her own hands, she knew she was already home. Winter settled over the high valley, blanketing the mountains in a deep and profound silence. The world was reduced to white snow, dark pines, and the gray curl of smoke rising from the chimney of the Polaris assay office. Inside, a fire crackled in the pot-bellied stove, its warmth filling the single, immaculate room. The scent of coffee and bacon from breakfast still lingered in the air. Martha sat at the table she had built, running her hand over the smooth, planed surface of the wood. Her home was small, but it was entirely hers, every board and nail a testament to her own labor and resilience. It was more than a shelter, it was a sanctuary. The room was a map of her journey. On a shelf near the stove sat her father's copy of Shakespeare, next to a jar of Elspeth's preserved peaches. The window, which had once been a dark, gaping hole, now framed a stunning view of the snow-covered valley, the glass clear and bright. On the wall hung the deed to her father's cabin, a document she had chosen to keep not as a claim to be acted upon, but as a final, quiet vindication of his name. She had offered the cabin to a young family new to the territory, asking only that they care for it, a gesture that had cemented her place in the shifting moral landscape of the town. Her gaze went to the narrow mantelpiece she had installed above the hearth. On it, in the place of honor, sat her father's framing hammer, its dark hickory handle glowing in the firelight. Next to it rested the small silver locket from Silas Kane's strongbox. Two objects, left by two very different men, both of whom had, in their own way, provided for a future they would never see. She picked up the locket, its silver now polished to a soft gleam. She opened the delicate clasp. Inside was the tiny, faded portrait of a young woman with serious eyes and a hint of a smile. Silas Kane's lost love. A woman who never knew what became of him, who never knew that his last thoughts were of her. Martha felt a strange kinship with this unknown woman, a shared connection across time to a story of loss and hidden truths. She thought of her own father, whose quiet love and foresight had been a lantern in her darkest hour. She thought of Silas, the outlaw, whose 30-year-old confession had armed her with the one thing more powerful than the council's money and influence: the truth. A soft knock came at the door. It was Caleb. He carried a small sack of potatoes and a bundle of newspapers the stage had just brought in. He stomped the snow from his boots and entered, bringing a gust of cold, clean air with him. He didn't remark on the warmth or the comfort of the room. He had become a part of it. Their conversations were like that, practical and unadorned, their comfort with each other built on shared work and quiet understanding, a foundation far stronger than words. "Snow's getting deep," he said, setting the sack on the floor. "Figured you could use these." "Thank you, Caleb," she said. He looked at the locket in her hand, then at the hammer on the mantel. He didn't need to ask what she was thinking. He simply nodded, a shared acknowledgement of the long road they had traveled. Martha Mercer was 25, and she had been left with nothing. She had a few dollars to her name and was cast out to a ruin on a forgotten mountainside. But what she found there, buried beneath the stone and the dust, gave her more than a home. It gave her justice for her father, a future of her own making, and a place to finally, truly belong. The story of Redemption, Wyoming, is not unique. Nearly every town, every family, every nation has its founding myths, stories told to create a sense of shared identity and noble origin. These are the histories written in official ledgers and carved into monuments, the narratives shaped by the powerful to legitimize their position. They speak of courage, hard work, and righteous settlement. But beneath the floorboards of these official histories, other stories lie buried. They are the stories of the displaced, the forgotten, and the silenced. They are the truths hidden in a rusted strongbox, the confessions scrawled on a fading piece of paper, the names of the wronged in an unmarked grave. These truths do not rot or fade. They lie dormant, waiting for a hand willing to do the work of uncovering them, waiting for a voice brave enough to speak them. Martha Mercer's story is a testament to the enduring power of that buried truth. The wealth that built redemption was a lie, a glittering fade constructed over a foundation of violence and deceit. The fortunes of its leading families were rooted not in industry, but in theft. For 30 years, this lie held, protected by the silence of those who benefited, and the fear of those who suspected. It took the quiet resolve of a dispossessed woman, armed with her father's tools and his lessons in seeing what is truly there, to pry the stone loose and let the truth out into the light. Her victory was not loud. There were no public condemnations or dramatic trials in the street. The power of the town's founders simply dissolved, exposed as hollow. Judge Hemlock left town in the night, his reputation ruined. The Gable family retreated into a quiet, shamed existence, their social standing irrevocably diminished. The change in the town was subtle, a slow rebalancing of its moral compass. People began to speak more freely. Old grievances, long suppressed, were aired and acknowledged. The real wealth of the town, it turned out, was not the stolen gold, but the resilience of its ordinary people. The quiet integrity of men like Caleb Kane and the steadfast courage of women like Elspeth. The greatest fortune was the one Martha built for herself, a home made with her own hands, a community forged through shared work and mutual respect, and a future defined not by what was taken from her, but by what she chose to build. She proved that a person's true inheritance is not land or money, but character. It is the ability to see value where others see ruin, to find strength in loss, and to believe that the work of one's own hands is the most powerful force for change in the world. Her father had taught her to let the tool do the work, and she had. The tool was the truth, and with it, she had rebuilt her world. Thank you for joining us for this story. If you were moved by Martha's journey, we invite you to subscribe and share this story with others who appreciate tales of resilience and quiet strength. And now we leave you with a question. What is the most valuable thing you've ever built or repaired with your own two hands?